he says in the article. This nice, cozy state of affairs lasted until the early 2000s. But then something changed. These days, conspiracy theories don't look so crazy, and conspiracy theorists don't look like crackpots. In fact, today's conspiracy theory is tomorrow's news headlines. If you read my books, for instance, from the last few years, in fact, the last nearly 25, you'll see that they did make tomorrow's headlines in terms of what happened subsequently in relation to what was said was planned in the books. And that's not because of genius or prophecy. It's because when you uncover what the plan is and what is planned to unfold, unless something comes along to intervene in that, then it will unfold. And in effect, you're predicting the future, but not from the ether, from knowing what the plan is to transform planet Earth into a Alcatraz for humans. It's tempting, he says, I suppose, to say we live in a golden age of conspiracy theories, although it's only really golden for the architects of the conspiracies. From the Iraq war to FIFA to the banking crisis, the truth is not only out there, but it's more outlandish than anything we could have made up. That's a great line, because one of the greatest defense mechanisms to the uncovering or the acceptance in people's minds of these conspiracies or that conspiracy is the chasm that has to be crossed between the world as people have been programmed from birth to perceive it and is constantly underpinned by the mainstream media, etc., and what's really going on. And so there is a great effort by people who know what they're doing, and lots of people who just don't know what they're doing but have bought the lie, to discredit those people who are uncovering and communicating what the mainstream media won't. So let's just look at the definition of a conspiracy, the dictionary definition. An agreement to perform together an illegal, wrongful, or subversive act. Now, on that definition alone, this world is drowning in conspiracies. Another definition, an agreement between two or more persons to commit a crime or accomplish a legal or legal purpose through illegal action. Once again, we're swimming. A joining or acting together as if by sinister design. A secret plan or agreement to carry out an illegal or harmful act, especially with political motivation, plot, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and the act of making such plans secret. So that is the definition or definitions of conspiracy. And you can see that it's not just that there are conspiracies by those definitions, but we are deluged with them at all levels of society. And you still get people saying, do you believe in the conspiracy theory of history, or do you believe in the cock-up theory? As if they're mutually exclusive, as if you have to pick one or the other. And of course, it's a mixture of both. Of course, people make cock-ups, bad decisions, and then things unfold. Of course that happens. But when you do the research, most people don't, you may have seen some videos circulating on the internet, certainly they're on my website, in which I was talking some time ago, well before all this started, and further back in my books and talks, much further back in the talks, about the plan for a third world war involving NATO and the West pitched against Russia and China, and the fact that the plan was to trigger this out of the Middle East. The question is, how did I know that? And the answer to that question puts current events into their true perspective. First of all, forget countries. Forget individual countries. Forget individual leaders. What you have, and I've exposed this in such detail in my books over decades, what you have is a hidden hand that works through governments, no matter what party is in government. They're always there. They're the constant. They work through secret societies and semi-secret groups and through agencies and organizations that we actually see in the public arena but don't know the real background to. And they have had a long-term plan for this world and the human race. And it is to create a global fascist, communist, call it what you like, same bloody thing in the playing out, a global fascist, communist, Orwellian state of total control involving a world government, world central bank, world army, microchipped population and then some, world single currency, cashless, no physical money. Been talking about that for 25 years. Look what's happening. And part of this plan of transforming the world into this global police state and centralized tyranny is a series of wars. There's nothing that changes a society more than a war, and if you want to change global society, you need global wars. Look how fewer hands power was in after the First World War than it was before. And again, pushing it on, how that continued after the Second World War. And there's always been a plan for a Third World War to complete the process of creating a centralized global dictatorship, in the end justified by we must stop this ever happening again. What you're not being told is that those who will say that are the ones that have created all the mayhem to justify the transformation of global society. So what I'll do now is just put together a few pieces to put current events into context. In the year 2000, in September 2000, there was an organization in America called the Project for the New American Century. It was peopled by those who came in shortly afterwards to the Bush administration when it took power in early 2001. They included people like Cheney, became vice president, president in truth, and Rumsfeld became defense secretary, Wolfowitz, who became deputy defense secretary but was actually the real defense secretary, and a stream of others who came into significant positions of power in the Pentagon and elsewhere with the Bush administration in 2001. And they included a long list of prominent Zionists with fundamental connections to Israel. The reason that is significant is that in September 2000, this organization produced a document calling for the American administration and military to embark upon regime change after regime change in country after country, fighting what they called multi-theater wars. These countries included Iraq, Libya, Syria, Iran, etc., and also called for regime change in China. Oh, that'll be interesting. The people behind that document then came to power in early 2001 with the Bush administration. Now, that document in September 2000 said that this process of transformation, this regime change, would be slow, quote, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. One year to the month later, after they were now in power, America had what Bush called our Pearl Harbor, 9/11. As a result of that inside job, the official story is a fairy story. The process of picking off countries on the list began. With, of course, Iraq we've had, and Libya and Syria now, and it goes on. So, let's go to Iraq. Shortly after 9/11, matter of days, General Wesley Clark, former Supreme Commander of NATO, told a television program in 2007, he said that a few days after 9/11, he went to the Pentagon and he met Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz and all these characters, and then he met a general that he knew. And he was told that they were going to invade Iraq. And of course, Clark is taken aback. What do you mean you're going to invade Iraq? Why? The guy didn't seem to know because of compartmentalization. He probably didn't know. And a little while after that, not long, after America was now in Afghanistan, Clark went back to the Pentagon and met that same general. And Clark says to him, and go on the internet, put a few keywords in, and you can watch the interview. Clark said to him, why aren't we invading Iraq? You said we're going to invade Iraq. And the general said, it's worse than that, sir. And he pulled out a document from a drawer, and he said, we've just had this down from upstairs, in other words, Rumsfeld's office, and that they were going to invade 7 countries in 5 years. Among them, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Iran. And so they started to pick the list off. And of course, there was Iraq. The idea was to invade Iraq, but there was no reason to do that. This brings us to Tony Blair and George Bush and the infamous, blatantly mendacious, sexed up dossier talking about the threat of weapons of mass destruction from Iraq and Saddam Hussein that has now been exposed as a complete pack of lies. While Bush and Blair were saying right up to the Iraq invasion in 2003, it could still be stopped if Saddam Hussein will get rid of the weapons of mass destruction, which he didn't have. It's now known that Blair agreed with Bush on that invasion a year earlier. And I've shown in my books, years ago now, in fact in 2003, that it goes back even further. What was happening and why they needed the lie of weapons of mass destruction was they had this list of countries for regime change and acquisition, and they needed excuses. They go into Afghanistan, oh, get bin Laden, he was behind 9/11. What, from a cave in Afghanistan? Then Iraq, weapons of mass destruction, and in they go. And at around the same time, a weapons inspector called David Kelly, Dr. David Kelly, told a BBC reporter that that dossier justifying the invasion had been sexed up. In other words, it was full of bloody lies. And this was very dangerous to this lie to justify the invasion of Iraq, to pick it off the list. So he committed suicide. He committed suicide as much as I committed suicide yesterday. He was murdered, taken out. And the reason he was taken out, and the reason the official story of his suicide is so ludicrous and chock full of holes, is because he was taken out because he had the knowledge as a weapons inspector who had been to Iraq many times to know that it was all a scam. So, Iraq picked off. Untold numbers of people dead, slaughtered, maimed. A country torn asunder. And if you think, just contemplate the number of dead people that have resulted from the lies of Bush and Blair and the people behind them, where the real power is, it is unspeakable. And all this chaos that has followed on purpose, come to that, is the result of that same pack of lies from Blair and Bush. And far from making their millions since they left politics, they should both be under lock and key for the rest of their lives, with a key thrown mid-Atlantic. Let's look at the list. Libya. We'll have that one now. You keep giving the same excuse, war invasion after war invasion, then people are going to go, hold on a second, what's going on? So you keep changing it, or changing it a bit. So what you do then, you want to get rid of Gaddafi in Libya. So what you do is you train, arm and fund freedom fighters, better known as terrorists, to start attacking the Gaddafi regime. And when he responds, you say that Gaddafi is killing his own people, and to protect them from violence, you have to go in and bomb the shit out of it, including all those civilian areas. Go on the internet, go onto an image find search engine and put in Libyan devastation, destruction, whatever, from NATO bombing, or worse to that effect, and see how the people of Libya were protected from violence. These people are not just psychopaths, they're super psychopaths, and they're running our world, and we need to take it back from them. So, Iraq was left in devastated, catastrophic chaos, violence, upheaval. Libya was left in chaos, violence, and catastrophic upheaval. And they moved on to Syria. And they did the same job. They funded, armed, and trained freedom fighters of the so-called Free Libyan Army. Moderates. They're moderate. Yeah. They killed people moderately. In very large numbers. And they started attacking the Assad regime in Syria. Same script this time. And Assad responded, he's killing his own people. And so these terrorists were funded, armed, well documented now, funded, armed and trained by the West, particularly America, on behalf of the Hidden Hand. And all this mayhem and violence has unfolded. Al-Qaeda, which was the organization blamed for 9/11 and connected to Osama bin Laden and Afghanistan, that justified them going in there, actually was the creation of the United States. Al-Qaeda stands for the base or the database, and it comes from the database of Mujahideen fighters funded and armed by the Americans to fight against the Russians in Afghanistan. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter's former national security advisor, who is part of this hidden hand cabal, has actually admitted that he funded and armed and all the rest of it, the Mujahideen, which became Al-Qaeda. So we fight Al-Qaeda, well, we don't, these psychopaths do, or soldiers on their behalf. They never fight anybody, sipping bloody coffee in Washington and Downing Street, saying, we're going to fight the terrorists. No, you're not, you ain't going anywhere. I'm going to send other poor buggers to do it. So here we have a situation where this Al-Qaeda, the creation of the United States, and they use it then to fight in the Middle East, because Al-Qaeda's dangerous terrorists, and then these Al-Qaeda characters are involved in the fight against Gaddafi. So now they're not so bad. And then they move into Syria under names like al-Nusra and stuff, and the whole thing morphs into ISIS, another creation, outgrowth of the Western creation of terrorism to justify the invasion of countries and to justify, through terrorist attacks, the destruction of freedom at home. But what's happened is they were held up by Assad. Assad didn't go as quickly as they thought he would. They thought he'd go about the same time as Gaddafi. And it's gone on and on and on, and they've not been able to remove Assad and take over the country. And they had another problem in that Russia was supporting Assad. And it reached the point recently where clearly Putin could see where this was going. The United States and others, Turkey, what have you, France, was supposed to be bombing ISIS in Syria all this time to destroy the terrorists. But they haven't been. They've just been getting stronger. And of course, what anyone with a brain cell could see, and certainly Putin could, is they weren't trying to remove ISIS because they wanted ISIS. They'd created ISIS to remove Assad. They want to destroy him. So Russia go in to Syria, invited by Assad, the only people bombing who have been, and they start bombing ISIS and meaning it. And suddenly ISIS start to get on the run. Ooh, that's bloody bad news. That's the last thing we want. And here it is, the Russians now supporting Assad. We've done all this to get rid of him. Oh, what's going on? He's spoiling the party here. And so we had the attacks in Paris, immediately followed by the taking down of the Russian plane by Turkey on the most outrageous, with the most outrageous excuse, clearly premeditated. And look at where we are now, because there's different levels of this. And deep, deep in the rabbit hole, where the hidden hand is well beyond the knowledge of at least most of these players, they have the very circumstances that I've been talking about all these years for the start of World War III. They have now, on one side, the United States, the rogue state of Turkey. They have France. And, of course, Cameron is desperately now, and seems to be getting support from these idiotic Labour MPs who won't listen to the common sense of their leader. They want Britain bombing in there as well. So there you have NATO. And what is the plan? To pitch NATO against Russia and China. So you have Russia now in Syria with warplanes, and they're bringing more high-tech, state-of-the-art equipment in as a result of the downing of this plane. They're also supported, as Assad is, by China. And the plan was and is for a Third World War involving NATO against Russia and China. And also in there is another target on the list, Iran, supporting Assad. So you have this powder keg situation that has miraculously unfolded, as I've been talking about it would in the light of their plans for years and years. It's unfolded like this because it's all been planned from the start. And of course, the demonization of Russia started with Ukraine. Ukraine was subjected to the latest United States organized coup to remove an elected leader, not a nice man, how many of them are, but an elected leader. And in was put this guy, Poroshenko. WikiLeaks have revealed communications showing that he was an insider for the United States in Ukraine for years and years before. So they put their man in, and they start the demonization of Russia, and that's been followed by what's happened since. Do you know who orchestrated the coup and the handing over of power to America's man in Ukraine? A lady called Victoria Nuland, Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs at the US State Department. Do you know who her husband is? Robert Kagan, co-founder of the Project for the New American Century. It's a movie. And you Labour MPs better get your fricking asses in gear. Start using some brain cell activity. Start doing some bloody research and realise that you are being had again, not by a new war, but by the continuation of the same war on human freedom and human liberty. And you know, we've had Blair, Labour Party, does what he did. Now we have his opponent, whoa, David Cameron, Conservative Party, doing exactly the same, continuing the same script. In America, we had George Bush, Republican, did what he did. And now we have President Obama, Democrat, opponent, whoa, doing the same. You know why nothing changes except that? Because they're all masks on the same face. And when that penny drops, human race, we might have a chance of sorting this out. So, let's look at some detail and different elements of this. Jeremy Corbyn, leader of the Labour opposition party, faces threat of shadow cabinet resignations. Well, like I say, good bloody riddance. Because if you've not got the intelligence to see what is happening, you should not be in politics, because you are in dereliction of duty of protecting those who put you into office. And this is going to move along in the next few days to see what happens. But you see, the thing is, we've had this new leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn. I don't agree with everything he says. I don't agree with everything he does. But he's got decent values. He's a decent man, which is a hell of a start in politics, considering what you normally get. And he doesn't want more bombing in Syria. But apart from him, who was brought in because he was elected by members, not the MPs, apart from him and the few people around him, the rest of the Labour Party, opposition, is just the Conservative Party under another name. It's a one-party state, just like America is. And that is why they are talking about voting with the Conservative Party to send planes into Syria. Obama supports Turkey after it shot down Russian jet. Here we have a country that has at most claimed, as the most it claims at all, that a Russian plane entered its airspace for 17 seconds. Like I say, the Russians say they didn't at all. And they shot it down. Now, by any criteria, That is madness. And had Syria done that to a Turkish plane, then all hell would be breaking loose now. But this is how it works. It's not about whether something is right or wrong. It's whether it serves your agenda or it doesn't. Whether the people involved are on your side or whether they aren't. Which is why Saudi Arabia, who are on the side of the cabal, can do what the hell they like. Same with Bahrain. Terrorism of extraordinary levels. And not a word is ever said by these moral psychopaths. And so, of course, Obama and NATO were not going to come out and say, actually, Turkey, that was bloody out of order. No way. Well, he's on our side. Of course he was all right, no matter what he did. Obama supports Turkey after it shot down Russian jet. US President Barack Obama speaks during a joint press conference with French President Francois Hollande at the White House. He expressed US support for Turkey after it shot down the Russian warplane and said Ankara has the right to defend its airspace. Oh, God. I mean, you know, either they're idiots or they think we are. Probably a bit of both. But some of us try not to be, eh? Turkey, like every country, has a right to defend its territory and its airspace, the puppet said. It's important right now to make sure the Russians and Turks are talking to each other to figure out what happened. Well, you know what happened. It was premeditated. It's part of this whole deal I'm describing. Oh, NATO, they support Turkey. Of course they do. Even though it is a country without which ISIS would probably not exist. And a country that is increasingly terrorizing its people and particularly its media. Turkey supported by NATO. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, see my books, has expressed the Western military alliance's support for Turkey after an emergency meeting of all the 28 members requested by Ankara over the incident. As we have repeatedly made clear, Stoltenberg said, reading from his script, we stand in solidarity with Turkey and support the territorial integrity of our NATO ally. Of course, there's this thing about NATO, that if one is attacked, then in effect, they're all attacked and they all have to support the one that's been attacked. And that is the process through which they want this Third World War to break out. The NATO chief called on the governments of Russia and Turkey to exercise restraint. Well, a bit bloody late. This is an interesting story. I'm not saying it's true, but this is certainly the kind of thing that happens. In the Arab media, information is in circulation that the plan to destroy the Russian aircraft was clearly spelled out between the leaders of the US and Turkey. It was reported in particular by Geresa News. According to the newspaper, President Erdogan allegedly received support from US President Barack Obama with a plan to shoot down the aircraft of the Russian Federation on the border with Syria. The compromising information in the Arab media was received from a source in the presidential administration in the United States, it says. Also, reports in the Arab media stated that the moment for the decision to attack the plane was taken by Obama and Erdogan at the summit of G20 in Antalya, which, of course, immediately, literally immediately, followed the terrorist outrage in Paris, just as the 7/7 bombings in London took place at the time of the G8 in Gleneagle, Scotland. So it could be, as I said last week in the video cast, be milked to justify further action on the script. Erdogan will continue shooting down violating planes. Of course, he ain't got to shoot down many more before Russia's going to be physically retaliating. And then where do we go? Turkey will open fire on foreign planes violating Turkish airspace in the future, President Erdogan warned amid a diplomatic crisis caused by the downing of the Russian warplane. If another violation of our aerial border happens, we can respond in the same way, said the genetic idiot. The plane was shot down within the rules of engagement announced earlier. Putin has said, we still haven't heard any apologies from the leadership of Turkey, nor have we heard any proposal to compensate damages or hold those responsible for these heinous crimes to account. And it says the aggravating the rift is between the two is the death of 2 Russian troops in the incident. The pilot of the downed jet was gunned down by fighters of a Turkey-supported militant group, the moderate rebels, as he was parachuting to the ground. And a Marine was killed when a Russian helicopter sent to rescue the crew came under fire from the ground. Moscow is saying that Turkey is shielding terrorist forces in Syria. Well, some of us have been pointing that out for a very, very long time, with the goal of continuing to smuggle oil across the border. I'll come to that. Turkey's actions are de facto protection of Islamic State, the Russian Prime Minister said Wednesday. This is no surprise considering the information we have about the direct financial interest of some Turkish officials relating to the supply of oil products refined by plants controlled by ISIS. One of the biggest forms of income of ISIS is selling oil from locations they've taken over, and to do that, they need the support of Turkey and, of course, Saudi Arabia and others, and that's exactly what they've got. And then, I'm not saying that this Third World War is going to break out tomorrow. But we are now very much more close to it than we were before. And the ante is being upped. This is a story of the Russian response. World-class S-400 surface-to-air missile system deployed in Syria. Russia Defense Minister has announced that the Russian Air Force base at Latakia will now be supported with these SAM systems after the unprecedented act of aggression, it says, exhibited by Turkey. He also announced the following enhancements to the Russian mission in Syria that are sure to generate anger from Turkey and NATO. 1, all Russian bombers will now be escorted by Russian fighter jets that will be able to repel any further air-to-air attacks. See the potential for this plan to play out in the current circumstances is now massive. 2 guided Russian missile cruisers have been deployed off the coast to provide long-range anti-air support, and all military-to-military contact with Turkey has been suspended. These SAM missile systems, it says, are truly world-class. It has a range of 400 kilometers and is capable of destroying tactical aircraft, strategic aircraft, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles. The whole thing is moving so fast as a result of what's happened. Another story about the Russians mentioned there, deploying a missile cruiser off Syria that will target threats. And then there's sanctions by Russia on Turkey. Russia is preparing wide-ranging economic sanctions against Turkey over the plane attack, and the Prime Minister has said the measures will be drafted within days and could hit joint investment plans. Speaking at a televised cabinet meeting in Moscow, he said the government has been ordered to work out a system of response measures to this act of aggression in the economic and humanitarian spheres. He said the focus would be on introducing limits or bans on Turkish economic interests in Russia and a limitation of supply of products, including food. And he said tourism, transport, trade, labour and customs, as well as humanitarian contacts would be affected. This is a point, actually, the biggest foreign source of foreign tourists in Turkey, which is of course massively important to their economy, is from Russia. And what you are seeing with these various incidents and terrorist attacks is the, I would say, systematic destruction of the tourist trade in the Middle East, because they want to destroy it not just militarily, they want to destroy it economically. And the more that the economies collapse, the more people will want to head for Europe in desperation. So what you've had, for instance, is this incident is obviously going to dramatically affect the tourist industry of Turkey. Then you have the plane taken down, the Russian plane, a tourist plane in Egypt, which is, of course, dramatically going to affect the tourist industry in Egypt. And of course, you had the grotesque terrorist attack on the tourists, the British tourists, on the Tunisian beach at a tourist hotel. How many people are going to be going back to Tunisia for a holiday now? There are so many levels of this, and I've just finished a book which is about to go to the printers. Should be out very early in the new year, which kind of explains how this whole thing can play out in such detail, how it's done, and you have to go real deep in the rabbit hole for that. Then there's a strange story running on RT this week. Mystery over who bombed Turkish convoy allegedly carrying weapons to militants in Syria. Now, Turkey has been the conduit for supplying ISIS all along. Like I say, it couldn't really exist without Turkey. And this story says, footage released online by the Istanbul-based Humanitarian Relief Foundation, the IHH, shows plumes of smoke from the burning trucks and people running about in panic. At least 20 trucks were engulfed in flames. This is after the Russian plane was taken down. The mission, however, wasn't sponsored or organised by IHH, the group said. No organisation has yet confirmed that the convoy belonged to them. Our teams helped to extinguish the fire. The trucks do not belong to us, and there's no information on who bombed them, an official of the group said. At least 7 people were killed and 10 injured in the incident, according to the Turkish news agency. The trucks were reportedly heading to a town of Azaz in northwest Syria. Since the news emerged, media has been furiously speculating about who was behind the attack, what the trucks were transporting, what the convoy's humanitarian mission was. So much support and supplying of these terrorist groups is done under the cover of humanitarian aid. Or maybe it was carrying a more sinister load than humanitarian aid, it says here. One of the aid workers who survived the incident said the trucks had been deliberately targeted, Reuters said. The nature of the humanitarian aid is also in question. Turkish media and the IHH say the trucks were transporting humanitarian aid to refugees in Azaz. However, a Turkish newspaper cited sources close to the Syrian government saying the convoy was delivering weapons to terrorist organizations. The Hawar news agency reported that Turkey repeatedly sent convoys with arms to the al-Nusra Front, the affiliate of al-Qaeda, and other terrorist organizations under the guise of humanitarian aid. Reports on Twitter went further. They identified the arms as allegedly Docker machine guns and small arms with ammunitions. In the wake of the recent downing of the Russian jet over Syria by Turkish fighter jets, some reports suggest the Russians were avenging the pilot's death. Many media outlets thought it was the work of Vladimir Putin. Now, here's another aspect to this. Russia is obviously, in in the focus at the moment, but China also has people in there. And something else happened amid all the furore over the downing of the jet, and that's that a Chinese hostage was killed, or reported to have been killed by ISIS this week. And the Chinese government says, in effect, we'll be striking against them. Now, China has its people in Syria supporting Assad, and so does Iran. So you have this, like I say, the lineup planned for the Third World War is all in that little area, which is about the size of Washington State. And this is a story: Iran quietly deepens involvement in Syria's war. And, you know, it's kind of interesting that they're on that list. And we've had this agreement, after all that kind of stuff about Iran's nuclear weapons program. We suddenly had this agreement out of nowhere, and that's kind of gone away. But it's still on the list for regime change and takeover. If this unfolds in the way that it's going at the moment, and we, of course, hope it doesn't, then Iran gets pulled into the fold through that means, rather than what was going on before with their so-called nuclear weapons program. A furore led by Israel that has a massive nuclear weapons program that America never talks about. It says here, the new offensive launched by Syrian government forces in the countryside south of Aleppo has shed light on Iran's growing role in Syria's civil war. Officially, Iran denies it has deployed any combat troops in Syria, but a week before the offensive began, it was reported that hundreds of Iranian troops had arrived in Syria in preparation for an imminent assault on rebel-held areas. Iran also announced the deaths of 4 high-ranking officers from the Islamic Revolution Guard Corps, and at least one of them, Brigadier General Hossein Hamedani, the most senior Iranian military officer to have been killed so far in the conflict, lost his life near Aleppo. According to Iranian media, 18 high-ranking Iranian officers have been killed in Syria in the past 3 years, but the killing of 4 in just 1 week, particularly one just before a major offensive, implies that Iran may be more involved in the war than has been previously acknowledged. Iranian commanders, or several of them, have also warned that they would take revenge on the terrorists who killed the general, Hamidani, suggesting the force might have troops on the ground in Syria. Iranian officials have so far said that the most significant contribution to the defense of President Assad has been the creation of the paramilitary National Defense Forces, which now had 100,000 fighters. And the general who was killed has said that 130,000 militiamen and women were ready to go to Syria if necessary. You can see it building here. It says here, Iran's foes may worry that the troops may also be feeling emboldened by the results of the troops and the government, by the results of the recent nuclear deal, which paves the way for lifting of sanctions, likely benefiting the force with a source of fresh funds. But that's just part of the script, part of the game. There is still the goal of doing to Iran what has been done to Syria, Libya, Iraq, and so on. US deploys dozens of ground troops in Syria. The United States has deployed dozens of ground troops to Syria, claiming that it will assist Kurdish forces, any excuse will bloody do, in their battle against Daesh, ISIS. Terrorists, sources say. The so-called Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said on Thursday that 30 US soldiers arrived in the northern city of Kobani over the last 2 days, AFP reported. Actually, you'll find it's far more than 30. And this Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, I bloody love it. All the mainstream media are quoting this, right? as a source of news about what's going on in Syria. And the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, that's telling the media, therefore telling people what's happening in Syria, is based in Coventry. And it's one man who hates Assad with a vengeance. He sits in his house in Coventry in the English Midlands, pouring out information about what's going on in Syria, all of which is anti-Assad. And because it's the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, one bloke with a massive axe to grind. And it goes on, US officials have told the Associated Press that Russia has directed parts of its military campaign against US-backed militants and other extremist groups in an effort to weaken them. Yes, because they know, the Russians know, that all those moderate rebels have just been created to remove Assad, including ISIS, and therefore, if they don't deal with them, you don't stop what's going on. And Syria has been gripped. Here's some figures for you. Syria has been gripped by foreign-backed militancy since March 2011. The crisis has claimed the lives of more than 250,000 people in a land the size of Washington State, and displaced millions of others. So we have boots on the ground, American boots on the ground, while Obama is saying there won't be boots on the ground. Or will there be? Well, there'll be some booties, some trainers. There won't be any boots. And boots on the ground at a full-out war is what the plan wants. And it's another one. Don't rule out British boots on the ground in Syria, says William Hague. This bloke was the former Foreign Secretary, a very strange man who always reminds me of a little boy in short trousers whenever I see him. British authorities should not exclude the possibility of sending ground troops to Syria if they want to defeat Islamic State, former Foreign Secretary William Hague has suggested, close associate of Cameron. In a piece for The Telegraph, he argues the extremist group, what's he talking about? British government, American government, Turkey? What's he talking about? Oh, ISIS. Oh, okay. The extremist group, which controls swathes of Syria and Iraq, cannot be destroyed without boots on the ground. That military presence should be Syrians, Iraqis, or other Arabs, but it would be a mistake for Britain or Western nations to rule out some of our own forces operating there if that can make the crucial difference to the outcome. Haig served as Foreign Secretary between 2010 and 2014. He was involved in all the destruction in Libya. He said the case for military operations in Syria is very different to that of Iraq in 2003. You must be joking, mate. He said the long overdue Chilcot report into the Iraq war will be a time to acknowledge that we were wrong about the invasion of Iraq, but we're all right now. It's always, well, we've learned our lessons. Mistakes were made in the past, but structures have been put in place to make sure it doesn't happen again. Now, we're going to do it again. Oh, God, the world is insane. Now, this is interesting. Haig, former Foreign Secretary, suggests one solution to the ongoing conflict would be to partition Syria and Iraq. The borders of Syria and Iraq were largely drawn by two British and French diplomats in 1916. He writes, they should not be considered immutable. If the leaders of either country cannot construct a state where all communities can live together, it might be right to consider international support for their partition. Kurds have shown their ability to run their own affairs. A subdivided Syria might now be the only one that can be at peace. Just so happens that the Zionists and Israel have the concept of the Greater Israel, which is the land from the Nile in Egypt across to the Euphrates in Iraq. And part of that Greater Israel plan is to partition Iraq and Syria. Now, oh God, White House gave ISIS 45-minute warning before bombing oil tankers. Now, as I've said, the United States has not been trying to defeat ISIS in Syria. It created it. Don't want to defeat it. Well, make a bomb here and there, make a loud noise, or we're fighting ISIS. But of course, they haven't been because they don't want to. And here's a classic story. Why did it take 15 months for the US to target the Islamic State's oil infrastructure? Well, the reason is because that's where it gets much of its money from, thanks to Turkey and others. But as soon as Putin and Russia went in, they started bombing the oil infrastructure of ISIS. So, of course, the Americans were embarrassed into doing the same, but as little as possible. That's what this story's about. Oh dear. The Obama White House is giving ISIS a 45-minute warning before bombing their oil tankers by dropping leaflets advising potential jihadists to flee before airstrikes in Syria. Get out of your trucks now and run away from them, the leaflets say. Warning, airstrikes are coming, oil trucks will be destroyed, get away from your oil trucks immediately, do not risk your life, the leaflet reads. The leaflet drops are justified under the premise that the oil tanker drivers might be civilians and not ISIS recruits, although it's an explanation that doesn't wash with critics. Well, killing civilians has never troubled them before, and of course these oil tanker drivers are connected to ISIS. And it says here, it's not like these drivers are innocent, uninvolved civilians like children or sick people, writes J.E. Dyer in an article. They're waging ISIS's war just like the other non-uniform participants who make up 100% of ISIS's ranks. This is how far the Obama administration is going to avoid collateral damage, and who knows, it might be worse. Front Page Mag's Daniel Greenfield makes a similar point, commenting, so after all this time, they came up with a great plan. Drop flyers on ISIS trucks so that the drivers who may or may not be ISIS members can run away in time. Meanwhile, ISIS gets 45 minutes warning. Compare the White House Obama approach to fighting ISIS to that of Russia. While it took the US 15 months to begin targeting ISIS, oil refineries and tankers, airstrikes by Moscow destroyed more than 1,000 tankers in a period of just 5 days. In comparison, Colonel Steve Warren said that the US had taken out only 116 tanker trucks, the first strike to target ISIS, lucrative black market oil business, which funds over 50% of the terror group's activities. US airstrikes targeting ISIS oil assets are so rare that public service broadcasting in America was caught using footage of Russian fighter jets bombing an oil storage facility in Syria and passing it off as evidence of the US targeting the Islamic State's oil infrastructure. US military pilots have also confirmed that they were ordered not to drop 75% of the bombs on ISIS targets because they could not get clearance from their superiors. You went 12 full months while ISIS was on the march without the US using that air power, and now as the pilots come back to talk to us, they say 3/4 of our ordnance we can't drop, we can't get clearance, even when we have a clear target in front of us, said House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Ed Royce, who while retired 4-star US General Jack Keane labelled the policy an absurdity from the beginning. But it's only an absurdity if your goal is to destroy ISIS, but it ain't. So, given that, it's not absurd. It's what you need to do. Leave them alone. And it says numerous analysts claim that the Obama White House's 15 months wait before it began targeting the primary funding mechanism behind ISIS was part of a policy to help Islamic State overthrow Syrian President Assad. Of course it was. Earlier this year, a document emerged confirming that the Pentagon foresaw the rise of ISIS and that Western support for al-Qaeda groups and other anti-Assad rebels in Syria would lead to the emergence of a Salafist principality that would help to isolate Assad. The bottom line, the most irrefutable truth, is that the US and its regional allies were all in on the use of Sunni extremists to bring about regime change in Syria, and that was the strategy from the word go, and a direct result of the strategy that is, ISIS said, zero edge. And the US didn't want to cut off Islamic State's funding because without money the group couldn't fight Assad. We have the New York Times also reporting that US Central Command may have engaged in a year-long effort to deliberately conceal the fact that the United States plan to demolish ISIS was not effective, brackets on purpose. Evidence also continues to emerge that ISIS is receiving support from state sponsors of terror like Turkey and Saudi Arabia. $800 million worth of ISIS oil has been sold in Turkey, a US ally. ISIS trucks are routinely allowed to cross back and forth between the Islamic State stronghold of Raqqa and Turkey, while the NATO country facilitates black market oil sales on behalf of the terror group. Documents that have come to light, a large cache of intelligence recovered from a raid on an ISIS safe house this summer confirms that, quote, direct dealings between Turkish officials and ranking ISIS members was now undeniable. Which brings me to this, a WikiLeaks revelation this week. Hillary Clinton claims Saudi Arabia is the largest donor to Sunni terrorists worldwide. Of course, Sunni terrorists, ISIS. WikiLeaks has struck again. This time they have revealed a US government cable sent from the former Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, to the Treasury Office that specifically alluded to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's substantial financial donations to international terrorist groups fighting the US armed forces. I mean, it sounds ludicrous, and on the surface it is, if you think that America is actually trying to do what they say they're going to do. But when you realize what they're trying to do, it all makes sense. While it's insanity if you see it from that other angle. According to this cable, quote, donors in Saudi Arabia constitute the most significant source of funding to Sunni terrorist groups worldwide. This is the same Saudi Arabia that is causing catastrophe, death and suffering in Yemen without a glimmer of response from the moral West, and beheads people every few days. Saudis use UK missiles on Yemeni civilian targets, says rights group. Here we have this moral Cameron wanting to go and bomb in Syria because of the moral crusade against terrorism. And here's the Saudis killing in Yemen using British weapons. Saudi Arabia used British-made cruise missiles during an attack on a civilian Yemeni factory, say Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. According to a report published by the Human Rights Group on Wednesday, remains of a PGM 500 missiles, or remains of a few of them, manufactured by the UK firm Marconi Dynamics, were found in the rubble of a factory that was targeted near the capital in September. The attack on a factory in the Sana'a Governorate, which appeared to be producing only civilian goods, killed one person and was apparently in violation of international humanitarian law, as if the Saudis could give a damn about that. And earlier this month, British Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond announced that weapons exports to Saudi Arabia would be halted if investigations prove that Riyadh is breaching international humanitarian law during its ongoing aggression against Yemen. You bloody liar. Of course they know what's going on. How much more do you want? Here you go. We'll send it to you. Go and kill some more people. The latest revelations show UK policy to be both misleading and seriously ineffective. Despite multiple well-documented cases of violations of the laws of war by the Persian Gulf Coalition in Yemen, UK ministers have consistently refused to acknowledge this, said the director of Human Rights Watch, David Mepham. Well, you know, see above. It's interesting. Yemeni sources say some 7,500 people have lost their lives in the Saudi attacks, and the United Nations puts the death toll at 5,700, including 830 women and children. But when this is how it, you know, I described the world once as like throwing 50 balls of wool into a little room, putting 50 kittens in there, and then coming back a few hours later and someone saying, sort out the mess. It's just, everything is so distorted, so full of ignorance. We live in a reality that is basically two worlds. There is the world populated, inhabited by the mass of the people, and then there is the world that is lived by those that are seeking to manipulate, control, and oppress and suppress those people. And those worlds are just not the same. I don't mean that one group is fantastically wealthy compared with the vast overwhelming majority of the rest. That's two worlds in itself. I'm talking about something deeper. See, we are looking at a long planned, as I've been saying for so long, conflict between the West and Russia, with China brought in as well. It's been long planned, and the pieces are being moved into place more and more, obviously. Now, imagine the mentality that it takes to coldly plan and manipulate a conflict that will cause fantastic, monumental death and destruction if it reached the level that they want. What would you need to do that? You would need a complete inability to feel compassion and to feel empathy with those you are going to kill, maim, and make suffer. And yet, we have at least two precedents for it in World War I and World War II that were both, as my books and others have explained in detail, were both long planned and didn't break out by accident or random chance. And when you look at what is happening in the world now in relation to this massive NATO build-up against Russia and this demonization of Russia, and when you see in an excellent speech this week how there seems to be just one mature world leader around, and that's Vladimir Putin, who was pointing out the ludicrous nature of what's happening because they have absolutely no desire to invade anyone. And there is no evidence that that is the case. All we have is rhetoric and well, outright lies and propaganda from the leadership of the West. So here we have this obvious attempt to trigger a war with all the human and environmental consequences. What kind of mentality could possibly envisage that, let alone plan it and want it and seek to make it happen? Well, that brings us to Halloween. This is, like Christmas, a great example of these two worlds that I'm talking about. To most people, not least in the United States, but wider afield now, Halloween is a bit of fun. It's when kids go around the doors, trick and treating, and they dress up as ghosts and monsters, and you have this apple bobbing and all this other stuff that goes on. And in the United States, it's become the second most profitable festival in the year, second only to Christmas in the amount of money that's generated. But Christmas and Halloween have a much deeper significance, and certainly so to this hidden hand, this other world of interbreeding bloodlines and their gophers that are manipulating world events and have been doing so for literally thousands of years. Christmas, for instance, is really Saturnalia. Saturnalia was a festival in ancient Rome during the Roman Empire, in the run-up to what we now call Christmas. They gave each other presents at this time. They decorated trees. They hung holly, a sacred plant tree to Saturn. And Saturn was the great god of Rome, hence Saturnalia. This was a festival to the god Saturn. And like so many other pagan festivals, Christianity, when it came along, which of course came out of Rome, they decided that they could get new recruits easier. Well, this is one reason for it. There are others. If they just took over the pagan festivals and called them a different name. So eventually Saturnalia became our Christmas and the alleged birth date of Jesus Christ, who is just another symbolic figure in a story that's been told over and over again throughout the ages and endless different cultures, each time just put into another historical setting with another name for the hero. But to this other world of these bloodlines and the world of Satanists, which these bloodlines are in their inner circle, Christmas is still Saturnalia. It's still a time of human sacrifice. And so Christmas is a time when the Satanists and these bloodlines do their rituals, including human sacrifice. And then, not least the sacrifice of children, by the way. And then we come to Halloween. This is the ancient Celtic and Druid festival. Druids, of course, the priestly class of the Celts. And they had a festival on November the 1st called Samhain. And the night before was basically the Night of the Dead. And they engaged once again in human sacrifice on one heck of a scale. And then, of course, Christianity came along. And as with Christmas, it hijacked Samhain and called November the 1st All Saints' Day. And the night before became known as All Hallows. I've seen it some places as All Hallows Eve, which morphed into what we today call Halloween. And Halloween, in the days of the Celts, was a great time of human sacrifice. And of course, humanity reached a point where this was no longer acceptable, that you could not openly do these human sacrifices as part of your culture. But it didn't stop. When it became unacceptable to do it in the open, it went underground and has continued ever since in the networks of Satanism and the elite bloodline families who are actually the force in the end behind Satanism. Satanism, where they worship their unseen, malevolent, demonic, quote, gods. And they sacrifice to these gods. And, we have this theme where the ancients used to sacrifice young virgins to the gods. Young virgins is just code, symbolism for children. And Halloween, while kids around, particularly the Western world, are engaging in trick-or-treating and dressing up as ghosts and monsters, while they're doing that and having their fun in that side of Halloween, in the shadows, phenomenal numbers of children are being sacrificed by these crazies, these psychopaths beyond words. And people might say, well, hold on, where do all the children come from? Well, if you perceive the number of children that go missing in the world every year by the number of missing children stories you see on the news, then you are massively, beyond words, missing the plot. Extraordinary numbers of children go missing worldwide every year, never to be seen again, at least officially. Now, not all of those children end up with the Satanists, but a significant number do. And these are where the sacrifices come from. And so often, a lot of these children are brought up in these cults specifically for sacrifice. And therefore, they operate in their own bubble outside of mainstream society, often with the connivance of those in authority who connect into these satanic networks. And so a lot of children that are sacrificed have never actually been officially registered as existing. They have people in these satanic cults they call breeders, women called breeders who are held in captivity and give birth to children who are then sacrificed, babies that are then sacrificed, sometimes even fetuses that are aborted and then used in sacrifice. I think I mentioned earlier that there are two worlds in our reality. The one that most people perceive to be how things are. But there's another one that is so horrifically different to that those in the world of the general population will overwhelmingly say, that's rubbish, that's nonsense, that can't be happening. Because this other world is so dramatically, fundamentally beyond words different to the world of the seen in general society. That chasm of difference is too much for most people to breach in terms of their perceptions of possibility. And also connected to this whole area of child abuse is this whole paedophilia horror, which has come to light very much in England in recent years, but of course now the lid's been put on that. Oh my, we can't let them know this. Shut it up, shut it up. Because the same networks are involved in the systematic sexual and violent abuse of children. It's all connected to this same network, which is why you have so many people in positions of power, politically and otherwise, who are both pedophiles and Satanists. So we have this period now coming up on Monday of Halloween. And to the Celts and the Druids, this was a time when the veil between this world and other worlds, the world of the dead, if you like, thinned, and the dead could re-enter this world, and people from this world could enter the world of the dead. Now, there's another big error that's made in terms of perceptions of how things are. And that is that knowledge can only move forward. That wherever we are at any point in what we call human evolution, it must be at the cutting edge of human knowledge. Not necessarily so. Okay, let's look at ancient Egypt. Now let's look at Egypt today. The very comparison between the two reveals that societies can go back in terms of where they are, as well as forward. And what is the key to that? It's knowledge. It's the circulation of knowledge, the circulation of understanding. Now, if you can systematically withdraw, suppress, which is what they've done massively through religion, not least Christianity, if you can withdraw and suppress knowledge so it goes out of general circulation, then that society is less knowledgeable, less evolved, if you like, in terms of awareness of reality than it was before. And there was knowledge circulating about the nature of reality in these ancient societies, like the Celts and so many others all over the world, that has been withdrawn from human society. It's just starting to come back now. And funnily enough, it's coming back into the form of things like quantum physics in our way of expressing it. But they knew, without using words like frequency and such like, these ancient societies, certainly the key people within them that held this knowledge, they knew that this reality was only one of endless realities that shared the same space as this one. Like radio and television stations in the analog system share the same space without interfering with each other unless they're really close on the dial. And therefore they knew that interpenetrating this world were other realms, what we would now call bands of frequency, that had very different realities. And they perceived them as the world of the dead, which is kind of true in the sense that when our consciousness leaves the body, it goes to other frequencies of reality. The body holds our attention in this frequency band we call visible light in the electromagnetic spectrum. But when our consciousness leaves the body, then it doesn't have that focus and it expands into other realities. So although there is no death, apart from the body ceases to function, you can understand why these ancient societies, like the Celts, perceived these other realms as the realms of the dead. And when planets and other heavenly bodies are moving around, they are impacting upon the energetic field, the energetic sea that we're constantly interacting with, the electromagnetic field. And therefore they affect it. And it's therefore understandable, again, from a modern perspective, how certain times, i.e. states of the energetic field, would see it thin out in terms of its frequency difference between this reality and other realities than it would be normally in other parts of the year. And these Satanists and elite satanic bloodlines understand this too. They just don't want us to understand it. And therefore, they can interact with their, quote, gods in other realms of the unseen more powerfully, more easily, at certain points than they can at others. And this is where these major satanic festivals come from. And Christianity has picked up almost all of it. In fact, many churches are actually built on former pagan sites where they understood that the world is interpenetrated by energetic lines of force, actually information, which people call ley lines and meridian lines, etc. And where many of these lines cross, fantastic energetic vortexes are created, which also thin out the frequency difference between this world and other worlds. And if you put something on that spot and you do your rituals on that spot, then you can interact with these other worlds more easily. And the early Christians were people that understood this. Were the people driving it did, and churches were put on these pagan sites, and this is why so many satanic rituals go on in some of these churches, because they're on these points. So this is what Halloween is really all about in the shadows, to those that understand what it really is and how reality really works. Now let's come back, therefore, to the build-up militarily against Russia, with the plan to instigate a third world war of mass death and destruction. And let's come back to the mentality necessary to contemplate that, let alone plan it. What kind of mentality do you need to sacrifice little kids on satanic altars, and to do it on a mass scale? How totally and utterly deleted of empathy you would have to be to do that. How totally deleted of empathy and compassion you'd have to be to violently and sexually abuse a child. That is the mentality that's running our world. That is the mentality that has no problem with mass bombing Libya to save the civilians from violence, with instigating what happened in Libya, with instigating what happened in Syria, and invading Iraq on a lie, with instigating what has unfolded in Afghanistan. These are the people with a mentality absolutely perfectly described by the sacrifices of Halloween and Christmas and Beltane and all these other festivals of sacrifice. This is the mentality that has absolutely no problem whatsoever with mass death and destruction. In fact, it gets off on it. It's what it wants. So, when people say they would never do that, what they mean is this world that they inhabit, in their minds anyway, would never do that. This other world wants to do that, is doing that, has been doing it for thousands of years, and is continuing to do it today. And only by understanding this other world and the extreme psychopathic, empathy deleted, compassion deleted mentality that operates there can we really understand the events of this other world that the rest of us inhabit. Halloween, Christmas, in their true sense to this network of Satanists and elite bloodlines, are times of extraordinary suffering for their victims. And there's a mass version of that, and we call it war. War is just, to these people, a massive satanic time of mass bloodletting and mass death. And this mentality, this satanic cult that runs the world, is a death cult. And you can understand so many things in the world of the scene when you understand this other world that drives the world of the scene. This is a story from this week, Wiped Out, and it's all our fault. Excuse me. Humans have wiped out so many animals that the planet is on the verge of the first mass extinction. Since the age of the dinosaurs, conservationists have warned. By the end of the decade, 7 out of every 10 of the world's mammals, fish, amphibians, reptiles, and birds will have been wiped out, according to the biggest ever report into extinction. Why would there not be mass death in a world run by a death cult? Not just death of wildlife, but death of the environment, death of the forests and the rainforests, and of course, death on a vast scale of human beings, which has been happening decade after decade all over the world, most notably in the 2 world wars so far. Now they want a third, and that is the mentality behind what is going on today. And we need to get streetwise to that, because if people go on naively saying, oh, that can't be true, they'd never do that, they will do that. With the passage of world events, contrasted or compared with what people like me have been saying over the years is the plan to unfold, have brought extraordinary numbers of people, compared with the past, to look at the information. And what they're saying in these increasingly large numbers is, well, this actually makes sense of world events far more than what the authorities are telling us. And this has reached a point where those very authorities, the form of politicians and mainstream media and all these different aspects, have to start to see the challenge from the alternative media and decide what they're going to do about it. And those decisions have been made clear in very recent times with the speech at the United Nations by the British Prime Minister David Cameron, in which he equated ISIS with non-violent conspiracy theorists, basically. On the face of it, the remark was idiocy, kind of idiocy with which people like Cameron have become obviously very well associated. But it wasn't that kind of idiocy, because there was a method in it, and that is to start to equate in the public mind people challenging the official lies, mendacity of government with supporting terrorism or creating the information environment in which people would turn to terrorism. And you can expect a lot more of this. These are just some of the opening shots. I'll get to what Cameron said as we go along. And you can also expect more and more efforts to undermine, discredit, and altogether turn people against people like me and others, some of whom have been putting this out for decades now. And I guess the best example before Cameron's speech, this very recent, in these very recent days, was what was said in a paper by one of what they call Obama's czars. This was a bloke a few years ago now called Cass Sunstein, and here's a report of what he'd like to do in relation to the subject we're talking about. Headline: Top Obama czar infiltrate all conspiracy theorists. Presidential advisor wrote about crackdown on expressing opinions. And it was what's described here as a lengthy academic paper. And Sunstein, the regulatory czar, does that mean he's regular? I don't know, maybe. And he argued that the US government should ban conspiracy theorizing. So you are deeply in to the world of 1984 and the whole Orwellian state of speech crime and thought crime. So he argued, and this is what this whole Cameron speech is about, and also the measures announced by the Home Secretary Theresa May at the Tory Party conference this week. This is what they are leading to and seeking to introduce. So let's just go through a few of these things. Among the beliefs that Sunstein would ban is advocating that the theory of global warming is a deliberate fraud. Well, it clearly is. And the evidence is overwhelming that it is. And it's a creation to justify the transformation of deindustrialization of global society, and to bring in something called Agenda 21. Google that if you're not aware of it. It'll blow your mind. Sunstein also recommended the government send agents to infiltrate, quote, extremists who supply conspiracy theories. See, this is the way the perception deception works. You hijack the definition of words and terms. So the government, even though it's terrorizing, bombing, slaughtering millions and millions of people in engineered wars and engineered famines and all this other stuff, engineered terrorism. Despite all that, the government's is the reference point for morality and the reference point for moderation. No matter how extreme they are, they're the reference point of moderation. And so you have this garbage that's trotted out by these people like Cameron and Obama, where they talk about American values. We're safeguarding American values. We are coming from a point of British values. Well, both America and Britain have been bombing the shit out of people throughout modern history. And it doesn't matter because they're the reference point. So the idea is that because they are that reference point of morality and balance and peace and justice, that anyone that challenges them, exposes them for the liars, frauds and psychopaths that they are, is an extremist. Well, Big Brother moves on again this week, or more like Big Sister in Britain, in the form of Home Secretary Theresa May, who has announced more anti-terrorism measures. And you'll remember in the wake of 9/11 in North America, Britain and other countries, a great swathe of anti-terrorism legislation came in which the definition of what was meant by terrorism, terrorists, terrorist activity, was so ill-defined and so lacking detail in the definition of what the law was targeting, that those laws could be used across the society in general. And they were, and they have been. We have had some extraordinary examples of the way in Britain that anti-terrorism legislation has been used to keep surveillance on people and be used against people who are absolutely nothing to do with terrorism. I'll give you an example. One local council used anti-terrorism legislation to keep surveillance on a couple to make sure that they did live in the catchment area of the school they'd applied for their child to attend. And this is what has been going on. And so when something comes out and someone makes a speech like Theresa May this week and says, you know, these are new laws against terrorism and terrorist activity, or this new word now, laws against extremism, define extremism, exactly. And so the laws that they are bringing in, the new ones announced this week, are designed in just the same way to be applied to the anti-terrorism legislation. And this is a newspaper report on Theresa May's stuff this week. Universities will have to ban hate preachers from speaking on campus under a crackdown unveiled yesterday by Theresa May. Once again, we're looking for definitions. What defines a hate preacher? Some of it can be obvious. They're preaching hatred against people and preaching violence against people and war against people. Yeah, you can see that. But unless it's absolutely defined, you can then start to widen that. So governments say, well, this person exposing this politician or exposing this scam and conspiracy within government is preaching hatred against government, hatred against government ministers. And it could very easily be widened to do that, and is. I mean, the examples are there endlessly from previous legislation claiming to be against terrorism. Schools, colleges, prisons and councils will also be ordered to put in place anti-extremism policies. Okay, define extremism. Again, well, you can define it in a small area.